I remember exactly how everything seemed so normal just a couple of weeks ago. My name is Michael, and I've been married to my wife, Emily, for nearly 10 years now. We live in a quiet suburb outside of Denver, Colorado, where neatly trimmed lawns and driveway basketball hoops line the streets. If you had asked me a month ago, I would have described our marriage as happy, maybe with a few cracks here and there, but nothing unusual after nearly a decade together. I'm 36, and Emily is 34. We've built a life together, or so I thought. I work for a medical equipment sales company, and my job often takes me on the road. Emily works part-time at a local boutique called Golden Petals, a charming little store that sells handmade jewelry, locally sourced decor, and unique floral arrangements. She enjoys the creative side of her job, interacting with customers, designing displays, and exploring new crafts. We used to talk a lot more about her day, the projects she was working on, and the interesting people who came into the boutique. Over the past several months, though, our conversations became briefer. Maybe I was simply too absorbed in my work, or maybe she started to pull away. Either way, I missed the shift until it was too late. Emily and I met when we were both in college. She was studying graphic design, and I was pursuing a business degree. We clicked instantly. In those early days, there was a kind of excitement and ease to everything we did. We used to stay up late watching old movies or discussing our hopes for the future. After graduation, we got married in a small ceremony by a lake. It was beautiful. Over time, careers kicked in, schedules got busier, and life just kept moving faster. I suppose we never had a perfect marriage, no one really does, but I truly believed we had mutual respect and trust. We used to plan vacations once a year. We'd pick someplace scenic, maybe a spot on the West Coast or a national park we hadn't been to before. In the last year, though, my business trips started to pile up. I'd be gone for days, sometimes a week or two at a stretch, zipping off to Phoenix, Seattle, or down to Austin to meet clients. Emily stayed behind, overseeing our home and ensuring our day-to-day life stayed on track. The first inkling that something was amiss probably came when I noticed how Emily seemed a bit distant. She wasn't unhappy exactly, just detached. She'd be on her phone more, and when I'd come back from a trip, she looked anxious or even annoyed instead of excited. I chalked it up to stress or boredom. We tried to talk about it, but our conversations usually ended with her saying she was just tired or had a headache. We never delved deeper. In retrospect, that was probably my biggest failing. I didn't want to push her, so I let things lie. If you'd seen us at a friend's party or a neighborhood barbecue, you'd never guess we had any troubles. We worked like a polished couple, making small talk, sharing jokes. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming. Invisible but real. I kept ignoring the signals. Part of me just believed that Emily and I had been together so long, we'd weather any storm. Looking back, I wish I had seen the warning signs for what they were. I wish I had confronted her gently about my suspicions. It's not that I expected or even imagined she could be unfaithful. I just thought she was going through a personal rough patch, maybe loneliness, maybe dissatisfaction with her job or routine. Then again, it's easy to blame myself now because, in truth, I had no reason to suspect something as drastic as an affair. Everything was so normal, so mundane. The day before I left on my next trip, we sat down for dinner. I remember thinking, she looks distracted tonight. She pushed her food around on her plate, forcing a half-smile whenever I tried to lighten the mood. I told her about my upcoming schedule, how I'd be gone for 4 days in Chicago. She nodded, said she'd miss me, and we ended the night in front of the television, separate and silent. In that moment, I could have never predicted just how drastically our lives were about to change. I had no idea that the very next trip I took would be the one that shattered my sense of trust forever. But as I packed my suitcase the following morning, I did feel an undercurrent of dread, a subtle tingle at the base of my neck. It was like an intuition that something was off. Call it a sixth sense or sheer coincidence, but I can't help believing part of me knew that life wouldn't be the same again after I stepped onto that plane. I left for Chicago on a Sunday afternoon. Emily and I had barely spoken that morning. She was scrolling through her phone in bed, an early riser for once, but distant. I remember kissing her on the forehead before I headed out. Her skin felt cold to me, though maybe that was just the chill in the house. Work kept me busy from the moment I landed at O'Hare. I had back-to-back meetings with hospital administrators, and at night, I mingled at networking dinners, trying to reel in new clients for the medical supplies we sold. Despite the exhaustion, I made it a point to call Emily around 9 p.m. each night. Sometimes she'd pick up with a rushed, "Hey, everything okay?" only for me to realize she was either in the car or speaking softly, like she didn't want to be overheard. During one of those calls, maybe the second night, I noticed something strange. I heard what sounded like clinking glasses or faint music in the background. When I asked about it, she said she was just watching a TV show, but her voice was off, tight, almost guilty sounding. I was too exhausted to press the issue, so I let it go. After all, everyone's entitled to watch a show, or maybe she was having a glass of wine at home. It didn't have to mean anything ominous. But the sense of dread I'd felt earlier took root again, and I felt a dull ache in my stomach. As the trip wore on, I found myself mentally replaying small oddities about Emily's behavior. She'd changed her usual texting pattern, for instance. Before, she'd send me updates throughout the day, photos of the dog, a quick question about dinner plans. Now, I'd only get one or two messages, sometimes none. She'd respond with short texts like, "K" or "Busy, talk later." That wasn't like her at all. I began to wonder if something bigger was happening. Maybe she was depressed, or maybe she was angry with me for being away so often. On Wednesday, I finally tried pressing a bit harder. I called her at an unexpected time, around 11 a.m., hoping to catch her on her break. She picked up, sounding a bit flustered. I asked how she was doing, and she gave me vague answers. "I'm fine, just busy with the store." My instincts were screaming at me to demand more detail, to ask why I heard voices in the background, but I was at a conference hall, and I had a colleague waiting to discuss a major deal. The moment slipped by. I told myself it was nothing, that I'd address it in person when I got home. Yet, in the quiet moments between meetings, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I even wondered if maybe she was considering leaving me. Our dynamic had been rocky, sure, but divorce? That felt drastic. Part of me chastised myself for letting my imagination run wild, the other part insisted I should prepare for the worst. By the time Thursday rolled around, I was mentally drained, half from the business obligations and half from my growing anxiety about Emily. My last meeting wrapped late, close to 8 p.m. I caught a ride back to my hotel and was about to grab a quick dinner at the bar when my phone rang. It was Emily. Normally, I'd be happy to hear from her, but this time, I felt a jolt of apprehension. When I answered, her voice was shaky, almost trembling. "Michael, we need to talk," she said, "but I can't do it over the phone. You'll be back tomorrow night, right?" She didn't even wait for me to respond before hanging up. My heart was pounding. Something serious must have happened, but I had no clue what. I tried calling back, but it went to voicemail. Unsure of what else to do, I tried to calm myself. Maybe a family emergency? Maybe she'd lost her job? My worst-case scenario was that she was going to ask for a divorce, but even that paled in comparison to the actual event I would learn about the next day. That night, I barely slept. I tossed and turned, my mind conjuring every possible scenario. Maybe she'd gotten into an argument with a friend. Maybe she was in some kind of financial trouble. The next morning, I left O'Hare at 7 a.m. and spent the entire ride staring out the window, bracing myself. I told myself I could handle anything, after all, we'd been through thick and thin. But as I'd soon discover, some revelations change everything in a matter of seconds. I didn't even make it back to Denver before the Betrayal bomb dropped. The flight was just under 2 hours, and I landed around 8 a.m. local time. By the time I grabbed my luggage and hopped into a taxi, I was already trying to call Emily, but she wasn't picking up. I was about halfway home when my phone rang. Her number flashed on the screen. I answered, bracing myself for whatever she was about to say. Her voice was frantic, and she was crying so hard that I could hardly understand her words at first. "Michael, oh my God, you have to help me," she was sobbing audibly, gasping for air. I felt an icy shudder of panic. "Emily, what's going on? Talk to me. Where are you?" She took a deep, shaky breath and then spat out the words that changed my life forever: "He's dead." Oh God, Michael, he's dead. I didn't know what to do. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Please, please help me." I didn't have any context whatsoever. The taxi driver shot me a concerned look through the rearview mirror, but I waved him off. My heart hammered as I tried to remain calm. "Who's dead, Emily? Who are you talking about?" She hesitated for a moment, a pause so loaded with guilt and fear that it made my gut twist. He was here. We were," her voice trailed off in a sob. "We were together, Michael. It was, oh God, I'm so sorry. I've been cheating on you." I sank back into the taxi seat, feeling suddenly disconnected from my own body. It was as though the city around me blurred, and all I could hear was the blood pounding in my ears. "You're telling me, wait, what the hell are you saying?" I managed, choking on the words. "I'm so sorry," she said again, and I could barely hear her over her sobs. "We were in bed together, and he suddenly clutched his chest. He collapsed. I called 911, but by the time they arrived, his heart had already stopped. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. Anger, betrayal, confusion, a storm of emotions battered me. Finally, I found my voice. "Emily, are you hurt? Is anyone else there?" Her sobs grew quieter, and she took a moment to respond. "The paramedics took him away. The police want to ask questions. I don't know what to do. You have to come home. Please, I need you. I'm so sorry." My mind reeled. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to unleash the fury and heartbreak exploding in my chest. Another part of me, oddly enough, was worried about the legal ramifications and her immediate safety. After all, a man had died in our home. My wife was complicit, though not in his death, obviously, but in the circumstances leading to it. That day, for better or worse, I found out how far my protective instincts would go, even in the face of such a monstrous betrayal. I told the taxi driver to step on it. After a few minutes of white-knuckled silence, I managed to speak again. "Emily, I'm almost home. Stay put. Don't talk to anyone until I get there." She nodded, sniffling. "Okay," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Michael." The call ended, and I was left in a suffocating confusion. My wife had just confessed to an affair, and not just a fleeting fling, but something that had obviously been going on long enough for her to call me in absolute panic after the man died mid-act. The taxi pulled into our driveway. The front door to the house was wide open, and I could see a police cruiser parked in front of our neighbor's house. My heart felt like it was about to burst from my chest. Taking a deep breath, I braced myself for the chaos waiting behind that door. Little did I know that the chaos had only just begun. As soon as I stepped out of the taxi, I saw Emily standing in the doorway. She looked pale, her eyes red from crying, her hair disheveled. She was wrapped in a thin robe, and her entire body appeared to be trembling. I paid the driver quickly and hurried to her side, feeling both an urgent need to protect her and a rising wave of anger I could barely contain. She flung herself at me, burying her face in my chest. "Michael, I'm sorry," she muttered over and over between sobs. I didn't hug her back. I simply stood there, stiff, my mind racing. Inside the house, the living room was in disarray, cushions overturned, a half-empty bottle of wine on the coffee table, glasses scattered around. It all told a story I wanted no part of. The reality of what had happened was hitting me hard. Some man, a stranger to me, had been here just minutes or hours earlier, having sex with my wife, and now he was dead. I spotted a couple of police officers standing outside on our porch, quietly talking. One of them, a middle-aged man with a serious expression, stepped forward. "Sir, are you Mr. Carter?" he asked calmly. "Yes," I stammered. He glanced at Emily. "We have a few questions for your wife regarding the deceased individual removed from the property. We've got the paramedic statements. We understand it might have been a medical emergency." Emily was trembling. I knew she was terrified of the implications. She kept her eyes on the floor, tears sliding down her cheeks. I swallowed hard, summoning the composure I'd learned in business negotiations, though no business deal had ever felt this dire. "Officers, will fully cooperate," I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. "Whatever you need." They nodded, took down our contact information, and asked for Emily's official statement. She explained that the man, a friend named Daniel, had come over and that during their visit, he suddenly complained of chest pains. She called 911 immediately, but he was unresponsive by the time the paramedics arrived. The officer asked if Daniel had any known medical conditions or if he'd consumed alcohol or drugs. Emily said she didn't know about any conditions but admitted they'd been drinking wine. There was a subtle implication in his tone that he suspected something more might have been going on, but he didn't push too hard at that moment. With the initial inquiry done, the officers left, stating they might be in touch again once the medical examiner's report came through. Emily collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. I stood there, my anger pulsing but also feeling a sickening wave of sympathy for her. I should have walked away, let her deal with the consequences, but some part of me just couldn't, not yet. For the next hour, I tried to piece together what had happened while also coaching her on what to say if the police returned. She wanted to spin an elaborate lie that Daniel was just an old friend. I told her to stick close to the truth about the heart attack but leave out the sordid details. I didn't want her charged with anything like involuntary manslaughter or even suspicion of foul play. The truth was, he probably just had a heart condition that flared at the worst possible moment. Eventually, the house fell silent. I asked the questions I'd been dreading. How long has this been going on? Who was he? Why, Emily? My voice cracked. She looked up at me, and I saw a shattered reflection of the woman I once adored. He was. I met him at the store. He came in looking for a gift, and we got to talking. We exchanged numbers. It started a few months ago. I never meant for it to get this far. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to shout. Do you love him? Did you plan on leaving me? The idea of her having deeper feelings for this stranger made my stomach twist. She shook her head vigorously. I don't love him. I don't know what I was thinking. I felt lonely, isolated. You were gone so much, and I needed attention. It just happened. Hot tears stung my eyes. I turned away, pacing the living room. It just happened. Emily, affairs don't just happen. You decided to betray me, to bring a man into my house, into our bed, and now he's dead. And you're asking me to protect you. She sobbed harder, unable to respond. After a moment, I sat down, burying my face in my hands. My emotions were jumbled, heartbreak, fury, confusion, and most unexpectedly, a fierce desire to handle things, to fix them if I could. I was angry at her. I wanted to throw her out onto the street, but the weight of her predicament forced me to stay. We talked about what to do next if the police came back with more questions. I told her to be honest about the basic facts. Yes, he was a friend. Yes, they were drinking wine. Yes, he collapsed unexpectedly. But leave out the nature of the relationship. I reminded her that adultery isn't a crime, but there's a moral and reputational cost. Our neighbors might have suspicions if rumors spread about a dead man in our house. We had to at least try to maintain some dignity, for the time being. For the rest of the day, we operated in a grim partnership to tidy up the scene. I hated every second of it, clearing away the wine glasses, picking up strewn clothes. I couldn't bear to look at the rumpled sheets in our bedroom, but I did it anyway, stuffing them into the washing machine. It felt dirty, disgusting, like I was part of some twisted cover-up. But part of me was in shock, functioning on autopilot. When dusk settled, we finally sat down on opposite ends of the couch. She tried to reach out, put a hand on my shoulder, but I shrugged her off. I wished I could vanish or maybe wake up and realize it was all a nightmare. But I couldn't. This was our new reality, and it was as real and raw as any heartbreak I'd ever experienced. The days following Daniel's death bled into one another. That first night, I crashed on the couch, not wanting to be anywhere near Emily, especially not in the bedroom where everything had happened. She tried to talk to me the next morning, but I told her I needed space. Over the next week, the police followed up but only to confirm a few basic details. Daniel's cause of death was apparently straightforward: cardiac arrest triggered by an unknown heart condition. No suspicious circumstances, no signs of foul play. If that had been the end of it, maybe we could have handled our issues quietly. Maybe. But word travels fast in our suburban neighborhood. One of the paramedics who responded to the 911 call lived just a couple of blocks away. Before long, rumors spread that Emily had been with another man who died in our house. People whispered about it at the grocery store, the local cafe, and the dog park. I caught neighbors shooting me pitying glances. Some of them had the decency not to mention it, while others asked if everything was okay at home. My parents, who lived about an hour away, got wind of some rumor about a tragedy at our house, and I had to lie, telling them we were fine, just a friend who had an unfortunate medical episode. Despite the official word that it was a heart attack, the real story was out there. The scandal was too juicy to remain hidden, and it grew each time it was retold. I'm sure some folks believed Emily had murdered the guy. Others thought I'd been involved in some twisted ménage à trois. The reality was humiliating enough: my wife had been caught in bed with her lover, and he died mid-act. You can't make this stuff up if you tried. Meanwhile, Emily was a mess of guilt and sorrow. She'd confide in me at night, either tearful or silent. She kept asking for forgiveness, begging me not to leave. As raw as I felt, I told her we'd have to take it one day at a time. Anger still boiled in my veins, but there was a tiny piece of me that felt sorry for her. She hadn't planned for someone to die. She was dealing with trauma and the weight of her own betrayal. After about a week of this shaky routine, I noticed a stack of mail on the kitchen counter. One envelope stood out, an attorney's letter, presumably addressed to the estate of Daniel Harris, but it was mistakenly delivered to our address. I stared at it, feeling the enormity of this intrusion into our lives. This man had a life, maybe a family, maybe kids, and he died in my house. On top of that, his last memories on earth were with my wife. The thought made me sick. I confronted Emily that night. Did you ever meet his family? Does he have a wife? Children? Who was he, really? Her eyes brimmed with tears. He was a divorced father of one. He mentioned a son. I never met him. He always said their relationship was complicated. My voice was cold. So you had an affair with a man who had a family of his own. Well, at least you two had something in common, you were both betraying people you claimed to love. She said nothing, a fresh wave of tears sliding down her cheeks. Part of me found her tears infuriating. I felt she had no right to cry, not when I was the real victim here. Yet, I also recognized she was stuck in her own cycle of guilt and fear. Within our household, tension became almost unbearable. She tried to show remorse, cooking my favorite meals, tidying the house, asking if I wanted to go out for coffee. I kept refusing, uninterested in playing nice. Each time I looked at her, I replayed the mental image of her and Daniel together. I imagined them laughing, whispering, doing all the things we once did in the early days of our relationship. In the midst of this cold war between us, the police called once more to finalize details. They'd ruled Daniel's death as natural causes, no charges, no ongoing investigation. With that official closure, my anger had no real outlet. There was no hearing or trial to focus on. The entire fiasco was left for me and Emily to sort out alone. Finally, one night, Emily broke down completely. She confessed everything. The affair had been going on for 4 months. They'd met at her boutique, then began texting, meeting for coffee, and eventually sleeping together. She claimed it wasn't about love, it was about feeling desired and alive. She said she'd never intended to destroy our marriage, words that rang hollow now. She told me Daniel wanted to leave the city and possibly start a new life with her. She swore she was on the verge of ending it, but fate beat her to the punch in the cruelest way possible. Hearing the length and depth of her deception made something snap inside me. I couldn't contain my disgust. We fought fiercely, voices raised, tears streaming. That was the moment I realized there was no patching this up. The betrayal was too deep, the humiliation too public, and the pain too immense. Yet, ironically, I'd been the one who helped protect her from scandal, from official questions and deeper scrutiny. I'd put a lid on any talk of wrongdoing or suspicious circumstances. And now, with the truth fully exposed, I felt cornered in my own home. There was no way I could continue living like this, trapped by the memory of what had happened that night. I found myself outside, pacing the driveway under the faint glow of the streetlight. The air was cold, but I barely felt it. My breath came out in shaky puffs. I stared at the dark sky and realized that what once was my safe haven, my marriage, my home, had become a prison. I wasn't sure how to proceed, but I knew I couldn't stay married to a woman who'd broken my trust and still wore the evidence of her betrayal like a scarlet letter in the eyes of everyone around us. The next morning, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I would help Emily finalize any legal tangles, protect her from more scrutiny, and then I would leave. I didn't make a big show of it. In fact, the resolve came quietly. I woke up early, grabbed a cup of coffee, and started Googling divorce attorneys. My heart felt hollow but also oddly determined. When Emily woke up, she found me at the kitchen table, the sunlight catching the steam rising from my mug. The tension was thick, but there was a chilling calmness to it all. She knew, before I even said a word, that I was done. She sank into the chair across from me, tears already brimming. "I assume you found someone," she said softly, nodding at the list of attorney names on my screen. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I looked at her and felt a rush of conflicting memories, our wedding day by the lake, her laughter echoing through the house during Christmas, the gentle warmth of her hand in mine during a long car ride. All of it overshadowed by her betrayal. Finally, I swallowed and said, "Yes. Yes, I'll be contacting a lawyer today." She winced, tears slipping down her face. "Michael, please. I know it doesn't matter now, but I truly didn't want this to happen." My voice was low but steady. "It does matter, Emily. What you did matters. And what I'm about to do is the only choice I have left if I want to salvage any self-respect." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. I'll help you deal with any questions about Daniel's death, if the authorities come back or if you need to speak with his family. I'll stand by you, make sure you're not alone for that. But after that's done, I'm gone. She nodded, tears carving silent trails down her cheeks. I understand, she whispered. Over the next couple of weeks, we shifted into a strange partnership again, not entirely unlike the days immediately following Daniel's death. We didn't speak much unless it was about official matters, the final police report, which confirmed natural causes, the possibility of Daniel's next of kin contacting her, the uncomfortable logistics of what a divorce would look like, splitting assets, deciding who would move out. Each conversation felt clinical, like we were business associates negotiating a deal. Beneath it all, there was a raw ache that never went away. Emily's boutique manager found out about the rumors swirling around town. Fearing bad publicity, they quietly let her take some personal time off. She didn't fight it. Our home had become her prison too. She rarely left the house, ashamed and afraid of running into neighbors. I still left for work each morning, though, to be honest, I was only half focused. My colleagues noticed I was withdrawn, but I blamed it on stress. It wasn't until I got a call from Daniel's sister that I felt I could finally see an endpoint. She was respectful, simply wanting details about her brother's final moments. Emily was too shaken to talk, so I stepped in. I explained that Daniel had been visiting Emily as a friend, that he'd collapsed suddenly, and that Emily had done her best to save him by calling 911. I left out the affair, of course. His sister seemed relieved to hear he hadn't died alone or in some horrible manner. The short conversation was painful and surreal. Here I was, the betrayed husband, reassuring the family of the man who had violated my marriage. And yet, strangely, I felt a sense of closure. After that call, I checked in with Emily. They were thankful that you called 911, I said flatly. She nodded, biting her lip. We both knew the heartbreak behind that simple statement. The next day, I started moving my clothes into a suitcase. I'd arranged to stay with a friend across town while the divorce went forward. Emily sobbed when she saw me packing. She begged me to reconsider. She brought up every happy memory we had, our wedding, the time we traveled to Colorado, how we used to talk about adopting a dog. But the words felt hollow. Love is built on trust, and once that trust is shattered beyond recognition, no memory is strong enough to hold things together. Right before I walked out the door, I turned to Emily. I want you to understand, I said. I don't hate you. But I can't keep living like this. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. I helped you because I once loved you, and I didn't want to see you destroyed by a moment of poor judgment. But love doesn't fix everything. She stared at me, tears spilling, her face pale. I know, she whispered. With that, I left. The divorce proceedings took a few months, but the emotional separation happened that day. Eventually, I moved into a small apartment, focusing on my work and trying to rebuild. As for Emily, she stayed in the house for a while before selling it, maybe trying to escape the ghosts of what had happened. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I reflect on the irony. When Daniel died in my house, Emily was desperate, and she turned to me, the man she had betrayed, to shield her. And I did it. I protected her from a scandal that could have destroyed her life. But once the dust settled, I knew I could never stay. I had helped her, and then I threw her away, or so it might seem from the outside. In truth, she had thrown away my love and trust the moment she welcomed someone else into our home. Life goes on. The final lesson for me is that betrayal can come crashing down at any moment, no matter how secure you think you are. But I also learned something unexpected about my own character. Even when wounded deeply, there's a part of me that won't let someone I once loved sink into ruin if I can help it. That doesn't mean forgiveness. It simply means I can walk away knowing I did what I felt was right. And in the end, that's all I can really hope to do.